This is a presentation about the economics, the ideas, and the politics of the Gilded Age, which is roughly the period from about 1865 at the end of the Civil War to around the turn of the century. Eric Foner dates it from around 1870 to 1890. It's not a precise definition. That is approximately the period that we're talking about. Now, as you can see here, one of the characteristics is extreme inequality. This is the Biltmore estate in North Carolina, and this is a famous photograph of poverty in the same time period. Um, Again, the Vanderbilt home, the Vanderbilt family, and the interior parts of the interior of the home that you saw on the first slide. And this is the Lower East Side of New York. Tenements. Tenements are very crowded apartment buildings where poor people live. Another example of poverty in this area. The photographer who made the greatest impact in recording poverty was Jacob Riis. He wrote a very famous book called How the Other Half Lives, and he was known as one of the most important photographers of the period. These are other Riis photographs. A sweatshop is an area where people work for very low wages, usually in the textile industry. And child labor was extremely common. You found it especially in the South. North Carolina was a center for the textile industry. And once the textiles were produced, the next step would often be done by sweatshop workers in cities such as New York. Now, we need to define a couple of terms here. There's a difference between wealth and income. Wealth is the total amount that you possess minus what you owe. So it's the difference between what you own and what you owe. Income is how much money you take in a calendar year. So there's a difference between the two. The greatest inequality tends to be in wealth, although it's enormous in income as well, because very wealthy people tend to accumulate more and more and more over a number of years. By 1890, now we're talking about income here and not wealth. By 1890, the top 1% of the American population had as much income as the bottom 50%. And by that same year, the top 1% had as much wealth as the bottom 99%. Those are incredible statistics. By 1890, 9% of Americans held 75% of the nation's wealth. This figure up here basically is another way of saying that the top 1% had as much wealth as the bottom 50%. If you raise that number to 9%, they have 3 times as much wealth as the bottom 91% of the population. Now, this is a chart, a graph of the trends in distribution of wealth. And you can see toward the end of the Gilded Age, you had an extreme inequality of wealth, and then it drops. It drops during the Depression. It drops during World War II, and in the 1950s up to about 1975 or so. And then you see the inequality goes up again, so that the level of inequality we have today, although this doesn't go all the way to the present, is almost as high as it was in the Gilded Age. And that prompts the term the New Gilded Age, which is the period we're in right now. In 2007, for example, net worth, that's the amount of wealth you have minus what you owe, the top 1% had more than a third of it. And the top 5% had 62% of it. The bottom 80% had 15%. Now, if you take just financial wealth, that eliminates things like your home that you can't readily turn into cash. The bottom 80% had only 7% of the financial wealth. The top 1% had 43%. So the inequality today is extreme as well. This is a chart over the 20th century, most of it, and the early part of this century. And again, you can see the pattern. Very high in the 1920s, and then it drops and rises again in the early 2000s. This is just a graphic that will illustrate the kind of division of wealth that we face here now. The bottom 40% would own as much as this red dot. 1% would own this. If you add to that the next 9%, 10% of the country would own this much, if land were wealth. Now, there is a debate among historians about whether industrialists are properly called robber barons or captains of industry. In other words, did they build the American economy and therefore are deserving of our praise, or are they deserving of our contempt? On the one side, they certainly created jobs. They raised the standard of living overall. They increased the overall wealth of the nation. They created a dynamic, thriving society. And they gained great personal success as business leaders. On the other side, they were greedy. They exploited workers, exploited the physical environment. They paid very poor wages. They allowed for dangerous working conditions. They did very little, if anything, to address that. And for their workers, there was no safety net. If they lost their jobs, they had no unemployment insurance. They had no disability benefits. There was no effort to really help the children, the elderly. There were no pensions. There was no health insurance. You were on your own. And of course, as we've already demonstrated, there was an extremely unequal distribution of wealth. Now, the ideas of the Gilded Age did not disappear at the end of it. You still see reflections of them today. One of the most influential was called the Gospel of Wealth. An Episcopal bishop in Massachusetts was quoted as saying this: "In the long run, it is only to the man of morality that wealth comes. Therefore, any wealthy person must be a moral person." Andrew Carnegie left very little money to his children, but gave more than $350 million to charity. And he's often praised for his generosity in doing this, sometimes with very little attention to what he did to accumulate this much money. He would commonly give money to libraries, and there's a logic to that. He believed in people's raising themselves up by their bootstraps, in improving themselves. And a library would be valuable to people only if they used it to further their education. So he considered this to be an ideal subject for his charity. But Carnegie was one of the most generous. Very few industrialists followed his example. John D. Rockefeller was one, but there weren't many others. Uh, Carnegie was generous with his money, but only if he could do it voluntarily. He was strongly opposed to taxes or government involvement in business. Uh, there were no income taxes and no corporate taxes when he was making his money. So um, he he had no responsibility in his mind to support the government through this income and anything that the government could do. Um, he also opposed giving money to individuals in need. Uh, he believed that careless charity caused dependence, made people dependent on the giver of that charity, and he thought it did more harm than good. And this was an attitude that was very widely shared in the Gilded Age, and you hear echoes of that all the time in modern America as well. These are examples of the Carnegie libraries. Some of them still stand and are still being used as libraries. Now, not identical, but in the same general category as the Gospel of Wealth is a harsher ideology or a set of ideas called social Darwinism. Its leading proponent was William Graham Sumner, no relation to Charles Sumner. He applied Charles Darwin's theory of evolution to society. This is very similar to the thinking of Herbert Spencer, who was saying very similar things on the other side of the Atlantic. Um, the social Darwinists believed that survival of the fittest made society stronger. And therefore, we should not interfere with the operation of nature. A drunk in the gutter is just where he ought to be, said Sumner. If someone can't make it, then we're simply getting in the way if we try to fight the inevitable forces of nature. So therefore, if you see that drunk in the gutter, leave him there. Now, there was a milder form of Darwinism that is called Reform Darwinism. And it agreed with social Darwinists in that human society will evolve and improve, but it will happen with the active efforts of reformers. So, although this evolution was inevitable, reformers could have a role in it. They could influence it, whether they're in government or outside of government. There's still evolution, but humans have some control. Now, sometimes this could be very nasty. Eugenics is an example. This was a belief that some people are superior to others, and therefore they ought to be bred to improve the overall quality of the human race. This is something that Hitler, for example, believed in. So to go back to the previous analogy, Reformed Darwinists would say, help the drunk get out of the gutter, but make sure that he's making his own efforts to improve and live a better life. So offer him some help, but if he doesn't pick up the ball on his own, then he can go back to the gutter, I suppose. There was a very important movement in the way charity was conducted. It was called the Charity Organization Movement. It began in London in 1869, and it crossed the Atlantic. And the second example of a charity organization society was actually in Detroit in the late 1870s. Their goal was to distinguish between, and these are their words, the worthy poor and vicious impostors. Some people who are unable to help themselves are deserving of aid, but others could help themselves, and they are considered fakes, imposters. Now, the challenge then was to distinguish between the two, to tell which was which. So these were private organizations, these charity organization societies, and they used middle-class volunteers that they called friendly visitors to go around to the homes of poor people and make recommendations to the charity organization society, which would then make that information available to charitable agencies. It was run mainly by native-born middle-class Protestants who often imposed their own culture, their own values on people from very different backgrounds. And this introduced a great deal of bias into the process. There will be more, you'll be reading about this, so you'll learn more about this as we go through it in class. The legal climate during this period, during the Gilded Age, was very, very favorable to big business, to corporations. The basic principle was that government could not interfere with the contracts that companies signed with their employees. It was an idea called liberty of contract. Corporations were given the rights of persons. In a case in 1886, there was actually a footnote to the case commenting that a corporation was a person and therefore had to be given the rights of persons. This was an issue that came up in the presidential campaign very recently in 2012 when Mitt Romney argued that a corporation was a person. It came up also in a very famous Supreme Court decision called the Citizens United case in 2010 when the court struck down campaign finance laws that limited the ability of corporations to give to political campaigns. If they're persons, then it is an expression of their freedom of speech, and they should be able to give to the candidates or causes of their choice, no matter if they could give millions and millions of dollars and completely override the contributions of many thousands of individuals. Another famous case was Lochner versus New York in 1905. New York State had passed a law that limited the number of hours bakers could work. This was a notoriously difficult occupation to have. The hours were extremely long. Of course, bakers have to be at work very, very early in the morning. And they were often exploited. So the state of New York passed a law limiting their hours. But the Supreme Court in the Lochner case said that this was interfering with the freedom of contract, the liberty of contract. So New York can't do this because what if the bakers choose to sign this contract? Well, then New York can't prevent them from doing this. Now, of course, the choice wasn't a real choice. If they didn't sign the contract then, or agree to those hours, then they would be out of a job. But the court looked at it very narrowly and didn't account for that fact. In another case in the same vein, called Coppage v. Kansas, 1915, the court ruled that companies can require what were called yellow dog contracts. A yellow dog contract prohibited or allowed companies to prohibit union membership. You would have to sign a contract before, right at the time of your hiring, that promised, that guaranteed you would not join a union. And if you were found to have joined a union, you would immediately be fired and could be under the terms of the contract. And again, the court said, well, this is just liberty of contract. The employees can sign this or not, and the state or the federal government can't prohibit their ability to do that. And it didn't recognize that this was not a relationship of equals. that the companies were holding all the cards and the workers were in a very weak bargaining position. Let's move to the topic of politics in the Gilded Age. In 1876, after at the end of the presidency of Ulysses Grant, there was an extremely close election, disputed election, that led to the selection of Rutherford Hayes to the presidency. He lost the popular vote, but won the electoral vote. But that was only because of an electoral commission that was agreed to by Congress, and this was part of the Compromise of 1877 that officially ended Reconstruction in the South. The pattern in these elections was that they were very close, but the differences between the parties, although they were significant, they were not extreme. In 1880, we have another Republican victory in the person of James Garfield, who in his first year in office was assassinated and replaced by Chester Arthur. And then in 1884, the first Democratic president since James Buchanan before the Civil War was elected, and that was Grover Cleveland over James G. Blaine. These were close elections. 4 years later, Cleveland lost to the Republican Benjamin Harrison, but then 4 years after that, he became the only president in our history, at least so far, to leave the White House and then return. And I might add that I don't know of any historians that would list any of these presidents as among our greatest presidents. The Gilded Age was not a time when the presidency wielded a lot of influence, nowhere near what it had under Lincoln, nowhere near what it would have under some of the 20th century presidents. Let's talk a bit about the positions of the two parties during this period. The Republicans generally favored protective tariffs to protect business. The Democrats favored lower tariffs, and that's a throwback to the period before the Civil War, when when the South was certainly opposed to high tariffs. The Republicans favored land grants for railroads, to construction to promote economic development. The Democrats, who represented farmers, among other people, had an enormous distrust of the railroads and tended to oppose those land grants. Republicans defended the independence of corporations. They were generally opposed to regulations. The Democrats were for them, for protection against the corporations gaining too much power. The Republicans, like the Whigs before them, believed in moral reform, for example, the temperance movement. The Democrats emphasized freedom in one's personal life. They didn't want any kind of government interfering in the personal decisions that people made. The Republicans' strongest base of support was the Northeast, business, the native-born, and Protestants. Democrats had their strongest support in the South, among farmers, immigrants, and Catholics. Now, if you look at the profiles of the two parties, there are some similarities to the Republicans and Democrats of today, but also a lot of differences. If you look, for example, at tariffs, the Democrats, if anything, tend to be more protectionist than the Republicans, so that's sort of flipped to a certain degree. The Republicans, however, still are generally opposed to regulations on corporations, and the Democrats are for more of them. The base of support for the Republicans is now the South and the Plains. And for the Democrats, it's the Northeast. So to compare these to the modern political parties can be tricky and misleading. The Gilded Age was known as a time of corruption in politics. The Grant administration was a great example of that, although Grant himself was not corrupt, as far as anybody can tell. There was also a lot of corruption on the state and local level. There was a lot of patronage. You support me, you support my run for office, and I will get you a job. Uh, this is not new. It goes back to Andrew Jackson, certainly. Uh, the assassination of Garfield changed some of that in 1881 because he was assassinated by a disappointed office seeker by the name of Charles Guiteau. And some people began to say, well, enough is enough in terms of handing out jobs to those who are supporting politicians. Um, the Chester Arthur administration actually reformed some of this, even though Arthur himself had been deeply embedded in the patronage system in New York. And reforms came out of this. Under Arthur, uh, the Civil Service Act, or Pendleton Act, was passed, and that at least began the process of giving government jobs to those who passed competitive exams, and not to those who had powerful friends. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 was directed at railroad rates. The railroads were charging some customers more than others. They would often charge more money per mile for short hauls than long hauls. There was all sorts of favoritism and corruption in that process, and the Interstate Commerce Act was intended to address that. It was not very strong, though. The Interstate Commerce Commission was created by this law, but they did not have the right to set rates. All they could do was bring lawsuits against railroads when they believed that the railroads were acting improperly. And usually the courts sided with the railroads. There's another very important law called the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This is opposed to monopolies. Uh, but in its early years, it tended to be enforced more against labor unions than anyone else because they said this was a monopoly of workers, uh, even though they had nowhere near the power of the employees that they were trying to deal with. So these reform efforts were a foot in the door, but were not terribly successful during the Gilded Age.